On September 2nd, 1609, an English explorer hired by the Dutch to find a faster route to the riches of the Orient steered his 80-ton ship off the surging currents of the North Atlantic and into an immense sheltered bay. Sailing to the mouth of the mile-wide river that flowed into it from the north, he pushed 100 miles upstream, hoping it led to China. It didn't. But though he had failed to find the Northwest Passage, Henry Hudson had stumbled upon something even better. One of the biggest and best natural harbors in the world. A safe haven, one fellow explorer said, wherein 1,000 ships may ride in safety. Of all the early explorers, Hudson was the first to sense the immense potential of the remote and lonely harbor.
New York is the finest harbor in the Atlantic Ocean. Just start there. And just as harbor, but it's so much more, it's an entrance into North America.
New York cannot be understood aside from its geography. Indeed, no city could. But New York more so than almost any city in the world. Because here you have what's really a natural location for a great city. It's probably one of the 3 greatest harbors in the world. And then what's key is at the very heart of New York is an island, Manhattan. So that the Indians, who were not in most places in the United States in the early 17th century, were on the island of Manhattan because it was a natural location for a great city.
As soon as they saw the sails of Hudson's ship, the local inhabitants, who called themselves the Lenape, rowed out to meet them, trying to keep pace with the strange-looking vessel as it made its way across the bay. 28 canoes, full of men, women, and children, one of Hudson's officers reported, seeming very glad of our coming. 15 years later, in the spring of 1624, the first boatload of colonists arrived to establish a permanent presence in the harbor, spurred on by Hudson's glowing reports of a fur-trading paradise, and eager to beat out their arch-rivals, the English, to the spoils of the North American continent. It was a business proposition from the very start. From one end to the other, the new colony was owned and operated by a giant corporation called the Dutch West India Company, the Atlantic wing of a vast trading empire that stretched round the world.
The Dutch East India Company, from which the Dutch West India Company we would call today kind of a subsidiary corporation, was one of the most successful commercial enterprises in the history of the world. For 200 years it returned average annual profit in excess of 10%. So when we talk about the Dutch East India Company, we're not talking about some cutesy little company. We're talking about a company that was more successful and more powerful than IBM in our own time. And they anchored their North American operations on the place they call New Amsterdam.
Most of the first Dutch colonists were not in fact Dutch, but French-speaking Belgian Huguenots. 110 men, women, and children in all, in 30 different families, cast-offs, hoping to make a go of it in the New World. They quickly settled on the slender island at the head of the bay, which they called Mannahatta, after an old Indian word, thought by some to mean Island of Hills, and by others, place of general inebriation. At the southernmost tip, they cleared land and built simple bark cabins, a crude counting house, and a stone and earth fort. Then widened the old Indian trail that ran north from the makeshift village and named it Heerstraat, or Breedaway. It would become Broadway. Other settlements soon sprang up around the harbor, including the village of Breukelen, named for a town back in Holland, and up along the East River, a sprawling plantation owned by a Danish farmer named Jonas Bronk. It was soon known simply as the Bronx. In 1626, just 2 years after the colony was founded, a ship carrying the first 11 African slaves arrived from Angola. They were quickly put to work building the fort and clearing land for white farmers. That same year, the Director General, Peter Minuit, called together the leaders of all the local tribes and made them a fateful offer. They have bought the island Manhattas from the wild men, the company accountant later reported, for the value of 60 guilders. The Dutch had, in fact, paid much more than the $24 of legend, but still less than $600 for all 14,000 acres of Manhattan real estate. The Indians, who had lived on the island since the end of the Ice Age, thought the arrangement temporary.
What's at the beginning of the city is at the end of the city, it's a real estate deal. And if there's ever a kind of motif that runs through the history of the city, it's that. It's the real estate deal at the beginning of the very existence of the city.
New York was founded for no other reason than to make a buck. The Puritans came to New England in order to worship God as they saw fit. The Catholics came to Maryland, the Quakers to Pennsylvania. The Dutch came to Manhattan to get beaver skins. And so devoted were they to making a profit that they didn't get around to even building a church for 17 years. And ever since, however big the city has gotten, somewhere deep in its soul, it is always New Amsterdam, where modern capitalism was invented.